I'm speaking because this is the only voice I have. I think I'm Scottish. I think I should have a vote in this referendum. In fact, I think a lot of people in England should have a vote in the referendum. I think all those people who represent Scotland at sport and who don't have a vote should be able to vote. I think all those people who from Scotland who are in the armed forces and out of Scotland and have had their votes taken away should have the vote. But that's not what Alex Salmond thinks. He thinks that 16 to 18-year-olds are his best hope because he can fire them up with emotion. Well, we'll see. But I wouldn't like people in Scotland to sleepwalk into the disaster that a yes vote would be without adding my voice, the little thing that I can do given that I can't vote. So let's first of all look at what would happen if you voted yes, what the consequences would be, and let's march through the institutions to see one by one. First, the Queen. For the time being, the Queen will remain Queen of Scotland, but who can doubt that half or more of the nationalists are against the monarchy? We already know that some of the people close to the leadership are quite left-wing, and whether it happens quickly or whether it happens slowly, I'm sure the Queen will go. Scotland will be a republic. Secondly, the armed forces. Scotland may keep, as they say, 3,500 soldiers. It may keep a ship or two or an aeroplane or two, but Scotland won't signify. The only thing the Scottish Army will be able to do would be what the Ugandan soldiers, for example, can do, which is take place in peacekeeping missions from time to time and be paid a little extra. There'll be chocolate soldiers. As for the defence industries, who thinks that Britain will any longer build its warships in Scottish yards? That simply won't happen. Sooner or later, all that business will go back to the south. Then we look at the pound sterling. I can assure people, having worked in the city most of my adult life, that it is not feasible or possible for Scotland to retain the pound. Examples of countries shadowing other countries' currencies have been given by the Scots Nats, but they're all little places like Monaco or Panama. Surely Scotland doesn't want to compare itself with them. The truth is that if Scotland, in the absence of the English central bank, the Bank of England, tries to retain the pound, they will have to have massive reserves, which have to be got from somewhere, from revenues. They simply don't exist. It won't work, it won't happen. And because of the uncertainties, and because the size of the banking sector in Scotland is so huge relative to the size of the economy, like the Icelandic one, the big banks will move down to England. To start with, it'll be the nameplates, but gradually it'll be the chairs and the desks and the people and the buildings. Bit by bit, it'll be like that waltz of Strauss, where one by one the musicians get up and leave. So the arc of prosperity that Salmond used to speak about, including Scandinavia, Ireland, Iceland, back into those heady days before the 2008 banking crash, will turn into not an arc of prosperity, but an arc of insolvency very quickly. But not only the banks will move, the insurers will have to move too. As for fund managers, I find that more difficult to judge, but I would have thought they would want to be in a great money centre, which London is, and over time they'll follow the banks and insurers. So the financial sector in Scotland would be decimated. As for the oil sector, Scotland is in some ways, or would like to think it's in some ways, similar to Norway, but it isn't. It has some things in common, which is that everything is more difficult and expensive to do. The infrastructure costs are higher because the communities are more scattered. That means that functions like distribution of goods are difficult. The costs are high. Norway has some of the highest costs anywhere in the world, very high cost of living. Another country which is similar is Japan, which is largely mountainous, where the costs of distribution are very high. That means goods in supermarkets and so on are going to be more expensive than they are in England, because the local Scottish units of all these companies will have to cover their costs, whether it's a television company, the successor to the BBC, or whether it's Tesco. And those costs will be higher. They won't be spread out as they are now over the whole country, including England. The difference will be that although you will have it's Japanese or Norwegian costs of distribution, you won't have Japanese levels of prosperity or Norwegian levels of oil revenue. So that will make people markedly worse off. We move on to the National Health Service. The National Health Service will no doubt remain, as in England. It's never been under threat. Embassies. Scotland would have to establish embassies. For a small country of 5 million people, that would be a great amount of duplication of cost. The BBC, as I said, will be more expensive. Programs made for the English audience will have to be paid for. You've only got 5 million people in Scotland, which doesn't pay for a lot of programming, and from the licence fees in Scotland, all the best programs will have to be bought in. The civil service, a lot of jobs which have been put in Scotland by the British government will be repatriated to England, and much work will disappear. And if the civil service, the banks, insurers are moving down to the south, then many of the professional jobs that feed off them, accountants for example and lawyers, will find they don't get the same work with the same quality of work. As for education, the concession under which it becomes possible, the loophole I should say, for English students to be charged more for going to Scottish universities will be impossible under EU rules once England is a separate country. So there's a benefit there, I suppose, for people from England, is that they will get the same terms as for anyone from anyone else in the EU. And I guess a lot of them are Scottish universities. As for the EU itself, the EU would doubtless allow Scotland to become a member, despite objections that might be put in the way by countries like Spain, which would be afraid of the precedent for Catalonia. But one thing they will absolutely insist on, partly because of their experience with Britain, they insist on this in all new members. They will insist first on Scotland being part of the Schengen Treaty, which means free movement, and secondly they will insist on adopting the euro. Both those things people are perhaps not expecting, but they will happen. They will mean that Scotland will have a different currency, one that isn't set a few miles away in London with input from Scotland, but one that is set in Brussels by the EU, and which will be influenced by the economic conditions in that axis of the Netherlands, Germany and northern France. What it will mean that Schengen is adopted is that we will have to have a border between England and Scotland that will be a real border, because if people have free entry to Scotland from any part in the EU, and England does not want to have people from any part in the EU, the most vulnerable border will be that with Scotland, so that border will have to be an important one. It may be, however, that there will be a period where Scotland is not actually in the EU, and then it will be even more important to establish that border for a period. I think these are among the issues that Scotland needs, or Scottish voters need to consider when they're casting their votes. This is not a small decision, it's a real one, and it will separate Scotland from the greatest metropolis, the greatest society, the greatest city that the world has almost ever seen, and a place where Scots have been able to express themselves and develop in a way that has never previously been possible. Through the union with England, Scots went to every part of the world